What if someone offered to pay you to let dozens of leeches feed on your own blood? Not just one, but dozens of them. You would have to stand completely still for hours in an icy marsh, no moving, no pulling them off, just waiting until your legs were covered with creatures slowly draining your blood. It sounds like a medieval punishment, but more than 200 years ago, for thousands of people across Europe, it was a real profession. And the strangest part? They weren't doing it for entertainment. They weren't doing it for science. They were doing it for doctors. Today, most people see leeches as disgusting parasites, slimy creatures hiding in ponds and marshes, waiting for the chance to latch on to anything that passes by. But there was once a time when leeches were considered as valuable as medicine itself. Doctors competed to buy them. Hospitals needed thousands every month. In some parts of Europe, leeches became so valuable that they were traded like a precious commodity, all because people believed in a medical theory that had survived for thousands of years. According to this belief, the human body was controlled by 4 bodily fluids known as the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If even one of these became unbalanced, the body would become sick. To restore health, doctors believed they had to restore balance. And the fastest way to do that was by removing blood. It may sound absurd today, but back then, it was accepted medical science. A headache, a high fever, pneumonia, stomach pain, joint pain, even insomnia or mental illness, doctors often prescribed the very same treatment: leeches. Millions of leeches were used across Europe every single year. The demand became so enormous that nature could no longer keep up. Doctors couldn't collect enough themselves. Hospitals didn't have the time. So a strange new profession was born. A profession where people used their own bodies as bait. They became known as leech collectors. But the leeches were never the most dangerous part of the job. The people who made a living this way soon discovered that every coin they earned came with a price, one that slowly destroyed their bodies. And very few people realized the real predator wasn't hiding in the water. It was the marsh itself. If you had lived in Europe during the early 19th century, a leech collector's workday would often begin before sunrise. Carrying nothing more than a few glass jars or a small wooden bucket, they would walk for miles to marshes, stagnant ponds, and wetlands on the outskirts of towns. These were the places where leeches thrived. At first glance, the job sounded simple: find leeches, collect them, sell them to doctors. But the reality was far more brutal. Leeches were surprisingly sensitive to movement. Trying to search for them by hand through thick mud could take an entire day and still produce very few.
Over time, experienced collectors discovered a far more effective method. They used their own bodies as bait. They stepped into the freezing water and stood almost perfectly still, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. Drawn by body heat and subtle vibrations in the water, the leeches slowly emerged from the mud. One by one, they glided toward the collector's legs and attached themselves to the skin. Surprisingly, the bite itself was almost painless. A leech's saliva contains a natural anesthetic, allowing it to feed without being noticed immediately. Many collectors didn't realize how much blood they had lost until they looked down and saw dozens of swollen leeches hanging from their legs. Instead of pulling them off right away, they remained completely still. Every leech they collected meant another payment. The more they gathered, the better the chance of putting food on the table for their families. Only when there was almost no room left for more leeches would they carefully remove them one by one, place them into jars, and move on to another marsh to begin the process again. Day after day, week after week, they earned a living by sacrificing their own blood. But the leeches were never the greatest danger. The real threat was waiting beneath the surface of those marshes, and for many collectors, the work left scars that lasted long after the leeches were gone.
At first glance, A leech bite didn't seem particularly dangerous. The wounds were small, they were almost painless, and they usually left behind nothing more than a tiny mark on the skin. But after spending hours standing in cold marshes, leech collectors began to pay a much higher price. A single leech only consumed a small amount of blood, but when dozens of them fed on the same person for hours at a time, the blood loss became impossible to ignore. Many collectors returned home exhausted, dizzy, and with blood still slowly dripping from their legs. Because a leech's saliva contains a powerful anticoagulant, the wounds often continued bleeding long after the leeches had been removed. In other words, they kept losing blood even after their workday was over. But that still wasn't the worst part. The marshes where they worked were filled with stagnant wire, deep mud, and countless bacteria. A small cut on a foot, or a fresh leech bite, was all it took for an infection to enter the body. And in an age before antibiotics, even a minor infection could become deadly. Many leech collectors suffered from painful ulcers that refused to heal. Some were left with permanent damage to their legs. Others developed recurring fevers after spending day after day standing in freezing water. Yet despite all of this, they couldn't simply walk away. Most leech collectors came from poor families. They owned no land, had little or no education, and had very few opportunities to earn a living. Even knowing that the job was slowly destroying their health, they returned to the marshes the next morning, because without those jars filled with leeches, there would be no money to feed their families. Perhaps the cruelest irony of all was that these people sacrificed their own health to help doctors treat someone else's. And just when the demand for leeches reached an all-time high, a new crisis began to emerge. This time, it wasn't the leech collectors who were disappearing, it was the leeches themselves.
By the early 19th century, the demand for leeches had grown beyond anyone's expectations. From small village clinics to the largest hospitals in major cities, everyone wanted leeches. Some doctors used dozens of them to treat a single patient. Large hospitals consumed thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands, every year. It didn't take long before the marshes that had once been filled with leeches began to fall silent. Places where collectors could once gather dozens within minutes now required hours of searching for only a handful. Leech collectors were forced to travel farther, stay in the water longer, and work twice as hard,
just to collect half as many leeches as they once could. As wild leech populations declined, their value continued to rise. For many poor families, the profession suddenly seemed more profitable than ever. More and more people entered the trade, hoping to earn a better living. But ironically, the more collectors there were, the fewer leeches remained. It became a cycle that no one could stop. In some parts of Europe, hospitals were eventually forced to import leeches from other countries just to meet demand. Even that wasn't enough. Nature needed years to restore wild leech populations. People could nearly wipe them out in just a few seasons. Then, just as leech collectors believed their profession would always be needed, medicine began to change. Scientists and physicians started questioning the centuries-old practice of bloodletting. New medical research revealed that removing blood was far from the miracle treatment people had once believed it to be. Many patients showed no improvement. Some even became weaker after the treatment. A belief that had survived for thousands of years was finally beginning to collapse. Doctors gradually abandoned the use of leeches for most medical conditions. Within just a few decades, the demand for leeches plummeted. The jars that hospitals had once desperately searched for were now almost impossible to sell. Leech collectors lost the only livelihood many of them had ever known. And like countless professions before them, their trade quietly disappeared into history. But the story of leeches was far from over.
By the late 19th century, the profession of leech collecting had almost completely disappeared across Europe. It wasn't because leech collectors had chosen to abandon their work, it was because medicine had changed. As medical science advanced, doctors gradually realized that bloodletting was far less effective than they had once believed. For many illnesses, removing blood did little to help patients recover. In some cases, it even made their condition worse. As new treatments replaced old medical practices, the demand for leeches declined rapidly. Hospitals no longer ordered them in large numbers.
The merchants who once traded them disappeared, and leech collectors lost the only source of income many of them had ever known. Within just a few decades, a profession that had existed for centuries quietly faded into history. But here's the interesting part. Leeches never completely disappeared from medicine. Today, in certain reconstructive and microsurgical procedures, doctors still use leeches that are specially bred in sterile medical facilities. When blood cannot drain properly after surgery, the leeches remove the excess blood. At the same time, they release natural anticoagulants that help keep blood flowing through tiny blood vessels until the body begins to heal. In other words,
After hundreds of years, history revealed something unexpected. The doctors of the past were wrong to believe that leeches could cure almost every disease. But they weren't entirely wrong. Leeches really do have a place in modern medicine, just not in the way they once imagined. As for the leech collectors, they disappeared along with an era when medicine relied more on tradition than on scientific evidence. Today, their profession survives only in history books, yet it remains a fascinating reminder that there was once a time when an entire medical system depended on a small creature living in the world's marshes.